Yes, so a very, very warm welcome to everybody to this Climate Leader 45 minutes digital launch hangout. I am very joyful to welcome all of you to this event, and I look forward to spend this time together with you. So we have gathered here today because of the remarkable project, a project who has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme under the Grant Agreement 101-024972. Remarkable is a project supporting local leaders to deliver a step change in progress towards carbon neutrality by 2050 or earlier in 7 regions across Europe. So the climate emergency and the energy transition agenda require a clear leadership, ambition, courage, and conviction if our 2050 targets and goals are going to be achieved. So in Remarkable, we are creating a network of current and emerging climate leaders who, through their action and inspiration, will drive their municipalities, public authorities, communities, and regions. And they will transform their approaches from one focused mainly on energy efficiency and renewable to one focused on the strategic goal of a climate neutrality by 2050. And these people will set new levels of ambition and compared to the national energy and climate plans, and showcase local leadership and innovation. So during this webinar, we're going to have the possibility to ask questions. So we are soon going to start, and I want to remind all of you participants that you are welcome to join the conversation and put your questions in the chat box. So after the session, we will have possibility and time to ask a question to our speaker. So with this, I'm very happy that we're meeting here today, and I am very happy to welcome you to our community. And I am also very happy to welcome our speaker this time, who is Ms Lea Ranalder. She has an M.Sc in environmental science from Lund University in Sweden. And Lea is part of the climate change and urban environment team at UN Habitat, where she works on multi-level climate action, climate diplomacy, renewable energy, and climate change mitigation in cities. She has recently been selected to be an expert for IPCC Special Report on climate change and cities. So I'm very, very, very happy to welcome Ms. Lea. So
thank you so much, Isabella, for these kind words of introduction, and also a warm welcome from me from Nairobi, where I currently live. I hope you can hear me okay. If you've been following the news lately, you might have heard that Nairobi has been hit by extreme rain and also extreme floods and just overall very bad impacts on the infrastructure, so also impacts on internet availability. And in addition to that, I think yesterday or the day before, there was an undersea cable severed somewhere, I think in Europe, which has apparently impacts on the internet connectivity in East Africa. So I hope you can hear me okay. I have no guarantees for the internet, but we'll give it a try. And in worst case, I'll turn off my video. But regardless, that was just to say a little disclaimer, so to say, about my potential internet problems, but that shouldn't stop us from having a good time together here today. Let me try to share my presentation because let me see, can I get a sign that this is working okay?
yes, it is great, Lea.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Just double checking. So maybe just to say what I'll speak about, and actually I have a lot of slides, but I will browse through them, and most of them don't have much text, but actually memes and cartoons and figures, because I think if we already talk about heavy topics, we can have at least a little bit of fun and visual interaction while doing it. So just a bit talking about the energy transition, who is, so to say, responsible for the climate crisis, who can solve it. I'll do a bit of a deep dive into cities, and then how we can also communicate potentially better about the opportunities for renewables. And then last but not least, speaking about the youth and opportunities that exist. So with that, I think this figure you've probably all seen. If we talk about tackling the climate crisis, we definitely need to, in very large extent, talk about the energy transition, energy being responsible for around 3/4 of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So definitely the energy transition is at the heart of tackling the climate crisis. And I think we've been hearing over the last weeks and months and years, actually, a lot of quite positive news about renewables. There was a report that came out last week that said, okay, we now have 30% of renewables in the global electricity mix, really driven by solar PV and wind, who've often been referred to as the king and queen of the energy transition. So really all to say that there seems to be records after records when it comes to renewables, bigger, better, larger projects, and of course also new records. And I actually thought this was a super interesting picture. Now, if you just look at electricity, you see that really wind and solar are growing. You also have other renewable and clean energy, so electricity sources, but that does not mean that fossil fuels are not also growing. The growth rate of fossil fuels is slowing down. It hasn't come to a halt or be reversed. And I think this is even bigger if you think about that energy and electricity are not the same. I think for all of you, that's not a surprise. But if I speak with a lot of policymakers and decision makers, if they speak about the energy transition, what they really mean is the electricity transition. If they think about energy, they only think about the light and maybe the fridge and the appliances in their households. They're not thinking about how to heat the homes, industry, transport, manufacturing, cooking, cooling, and so on. So I love this figure. With the iceberg saying the energy transition is a lot more than just electricity. For me, that sums it up all in one good figure. So, and that's actually also really relevant. This is a bit older, the figure, but that doesn't matter. Maybe also as a disclaimer, I used to work for REN21. I did their energy and policy and city work. So lots of the figures that you see here are, of course, from REN21 because I'm very familiar with them. But what that means with this figure, I think it just shows it also really crystal clear. The most of the energy that we consume is actually being consumed in heating, cooling, and transport, and only a very small share is being used in the power sector. And now it says here 28% renewables. Now that's 30. But I think the division between the different color blocks still stays somewhat the same. Of course, we're seeing an electrification of the transport sector and electrification of heating and cooling, but overall, these blocks haven't really changed significantly in the last couple of years. So that's why it's really important that we don't only speak about electricity, but we speak about energy as a whole. And if we then look at this in a bit more detail, we actually realize, if you see here, where we stand for today in 2022 and 10 years ago, that actually, yes, the share of fossil fuels and total finite energy consumption has decreased a little bit and renewables have increased, but so has our energy demand. And our energy demand has actually increased quite significantly, more than like 16% in the last 10 years. And most of that has been met with fossil fuels. So actually, we're burning more fossil fuels than ever. I think that's the big conclusion that we can come to. We are not nearly accelerating renewables quickly enough as we should and have to. And I think this is also just to say we have a massive investment gap. We need to more than double investment in renewables. And this is just for the energy transition. And if we think about overall clean energy transition, the investments are even bigger. I mean, if we think about the investments that need to go into electrified transport, into grids, into electrified heat, energy storage, and so on, these investment gaps becomes even bigger. I just love this big visual that we think about. This is where we are today. This is where we need to be. In brackets, we can fight about whether there should be investment in carbon capture and storage and nuclear, but it doesn't, just for the big picture to see where we need to be, I think this is a really helpful figure. So then just briefly, and I think this is, for me, it has always just been interesting. If I share these following slides, maybe as a disclaimer, in trainings that I give around the world, it always causes a lot of controversy. So just as a disclaimer, because I think if we think about who's responsible for the climate crisis, there's of course always a lot of finger pointing. And if we also see what's being discussed at the global, at the COPs, at the climate conferences, there's also a lot of controversy about who's responsible for climate change, because then also that means who should fix it and who should pay for it. So I think because there's different ways to slice that pie, right? So if you look at in historic emissions, you really see the US and the EU dominating that picture. If you look now at annual emissions, that picture changes very much. Of course, then now China and many Asian countries have the highest CO2 emissions. But then if you look at CO2 emissions per capita, again, you see that, for example, China's emissions are becoming, in comparison, a lot smaller, because China, of course, has a very large population. But then you see, front runners, Canada, Saudi Arabia. I think the first one is Qatar. Who are very much dominating that picture. And then this is actually my favorite one, because it's actually not in each country and globally, it's often the richest who are responsible for the largest share of the emission. And this was a study that was done by the IEA I think last year, where it says, well, the top 1% produce over 1,000 times more CO2 than the bottom 1%. And that really, and the top 1% really emit a lot more emissions, I think, than the bottom 50%. So this is crazy. So if we think about who's responsible and who needs to fix it. And I think here I want to kind of go into the question of, we can't just blame fingers, because in the end, we are all sitting on the same planet, but while we all sit on the same planet, we're all very much differently vulnerable to climate change. And I think this is now, as again, if you listen to what happened in Nairobi, lots of floods, massive damages to infrastructure, but especially in the slums. That's where the impacts of climate change were felt. I mean, these were where people didn't have houses anymore, where their entire livelihoods were being just destroyed and flooded and taken away. So, and I think this goes then now to the question, this is now, so to say, a summary from the IPCC. What are the solutions to mitigate climate change? And I think what becomes very obvious, that none of these decisions can be taken by a single stakeholder alone. We cannot just rely on national governments to mitigate climate change and get us out of this climate crisis. We definitely need a whole wide range of different actors involved. And I think these somewhat ugly arrows that I drew was actually a justification to say many of these things need to happen at the local level. So that's what I want to just spend 2-3 more minutes is talking about energy and the energy transition at the local level, where we see that a lot more cities are now passing renewable energy targets. And interestingly, not only in the power sector, but also for heating, cooling, and transport. And of course, there's a dominance of that in North America and Europe, but we also see other regions really picking up the pace when it comes to energy targets. We also see cities using their own assets and procurement mechanism to think about the energy transition in their own cities, installing renewables on their rooftops, having purchasing agreements, thinking about, okay, well, we actually consume quite a bit of electricity. We want to make sure it's green electricity. Having deals with other cities to say, if we bundle our demand, maybe we can get better prices on the market. And really thinking about how they can use their infrastructure and the money that they have to shift to renewables in their own cities. Of course, and this is now an interesting example from Helsinki, where they really thought about an innovative mechanism to overhaul their district heating system, because they said that's actually where most of our emissions come from. How can we decarbonize district heating using renewables, but also some demand side management to think about the energy transition at the local level. We also see cities setting policies for buildings citywide, mandatory. Often cities can say, if you build a house, a building in my city, these are the rules and regulations that you need to follow. And interestingly, we see more and more cities saying, if you have a new building in my city, there needs to be solar PV included on the rooftop or solar thermal. Or you need to, I will not give you access anymore to natural gas pipelines. So really thinking about what can we do to decarbonize the cities of the buildings of the future, but also the buildings that have already been built. So thinking about retrofitting often through fiscal and financial incentives. Why is that really important is because if you look at the global landscape, you have some building energy codes, but not many of them are mandatory. Many of them are still in development. So what's happening at the local level is really incredibly important. One example is, for example, Berlin. They really said every new residential building, and if you renovate your building substantively, needs to have solar PV on their rooftop. Berkeley, you might have heard about them. They were the first city to ban natural gas, and they actually got dragged in front of a court and they won, which really has kicked off also and incentivized many other cities to ban natural gas. Of course, then decarbonizing transport, as you might have remembered from before, 30% of energy demand, lots of that is, of course, very local. If you think about in a city, there's big opportunities to think about how can we reduce private car demand? How can we shift to public transport? How can we think about having better walking and biking infrastructure? And I think this is, for me, this is where my memes come in. But if you think about how much a car actually moves, you see that on the left, a typical European car is parked for 92% of the time. And now the figure, of course, is on the right, is in German. But I think it shows very clearly that most car parking spaces are bigger than children rooms. That also means we're giving more space to cars than to kids in our cities. And I'm pretty sure this is not only the case in Germany, but also in other cities around the world. And of course, if you think about the emissions coming from transport, the emissions coming from fossil fuel-based cars versus electric buses, and then, of course, bikes is significant. And then if you think about, again, the electric cars, of course, it matters where the electricity is coming from. You see here on the right an example from Australia, which has a very, the state of Victoria having a very coal-based grid. So saying, well, okay, great that you have an electric car, but if it's coal powered, how clean is it really? So just taking these things into consideration. And just one example, Bogota, Colombia became really a bike capital, especially during COVID, and is now thinking about how also to decarbonize their freight, which I think is really interesting to ensure, because they said there's so many lorries coming into the cities. How can we ensure that all these lorries, trucks, deliveries can also be more sustainable and based on renewables? And then as I hope that's the last thing. Me talking about cities is, of course, also urban sprawl matters. You see here Pittsburgh versus Stockholm, of population sizes and areas where they have a rather similar population, very different density, and that means also very different per capita emissions. So to think about, we not only need to scale up renewables, but also think about how our cities can be used better and have better urban design in order to make them also more efficient and just also less carbon intensive places to live in. Then I think this is almost my last thing because I realize I'm running out of time. Even though it's lots of figures, it's still I'm still talking a lot. I often find when we talk about the energy transition that when I talk to decision makers and I said, but it's so important to scale up renewables, that they are looking at me like blank and saying, well, but that's something that the national government should do. Or, but why does it matter? Okay, but what's really the benefit? They're so expensive. So of course, there are lots of myths. But then when I talk about, look, actually in your city, in your country, there's so much air pollution and lots of that is coming from heating because you have really inefficient heating or lots of it is coming because it's just such a car-based city and it's having massive impacts on your health, on the health of your kids and your grandkids, and it's causing really impacts on your well-being, then we can have often a different conversation because air pollution is sometimes a lot more tangible than renewable energy and what that means. So I've been trying personally to talk about renewables a lot more than just in the context of climate change and in the context of just the energy transition, but also talking about the co-benefits that it can create. For example, also controlling municipal costs. If you see that, of course, the cost of a solar PV have decreased rapidly as well for onshore wind, offshore wind, whereas the prices for natural gas, for example, have increased significantly and also have become quite unpredictable. So this opportunity of controlling costs and having a better planning mechanism also for costs is, of course, also often a convincing argument. If we talk about money, we of course also need to talk about subsidies that have reached 7 trillion last year. And I think the numbers from 2023 are very similar. That's, of course, direct subsidies and indirect subsidies. And these subsidies have even increased after COP26, where there were pledges to phase them, to phase out inefficient subsidies. So lots of money going into fossil fuels. That could maybe also go elsewhere. And then, of course, also thinking about the millions of people that still don't have access to electricity or are living in energy poverty. We often think about access to electricity being something that is often in many places in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia to a large extent, but energy poverty is something that's really so widespread, where also many European cities are reporting that 20% of the population there can't pay their bills anymore. And that's, of course, also quite shocking. And then as a last thing is, of course, the local job creation opportunities. We've been seeing jobs being created through renewables, actually at a very quick pace, and the outlook is very, very promising. And I think that's also where I want to finish at, is with the fact that we do see the skill gap, especially in the energy transition, widening. There is so many people that if you want to be serious about the transition, we need people to work in these jobs. There are jobs available, but often not necessarily the right skills available in order to fill these jobs. If we look, for example, this is now from the UK, I just pulled it up, is that many of the, there's so much demand for heat pumps, but not enough installers there. So that's just to say there is so many opportunities, especially for youth, especially for training and retraining opportunities, that it really means, I think, as a last word, we need to ensure that the energy transition is not only being driven by one single actor, but really by everybody possible. And with that, I'll stop. I've talked enough. And Isabella, over to you. I hope you have good connection. And I'll stop share my screen maybe for now.
Yes, Lea, great. Thank you for such a nice presentation. I think we are all very thrilled to listen to this, and it's really, really nice presentation of how this energy transition is taking place, all from global level down to the local level. So participants are free to put the questions in the chat box, and maybe some still are writing and having some ideas if they have something they want to ask. Meanwhile, I can ask you about, if we go on the local level, we were discussing about how the energy transition has such an important place in the local level. So I just wanted to ask you about, if you look on the local decision makers, what would you say that we need to do to speed up the transition?
I mean, at the local level, okay, now I can spend another 20 minutes talking about your questions. So thank you very much. I think at the local level, for me, it's a couple of different things. What I hear, and I think also lots of the analysis of the partners, and I've been working with also UN Habitat's analysis, is at the local level, it's a couple of things missing. Data. Often there's not enough data to even be able to take good decisions. And that is, of course, a vicious cycle, because if private companies are coming in, they want to see, okay, where's your data? Where do you see the developments in the next years based on your baseline? And if cities then say, well, we don't really have data, that's not a phenomenal argument for the private sector to come in. And that's also, of course, a very expensive exercise to have good data for your local level. And that's maybe something that cities in Europe and in North America might have good data, but in other places that looks very different. I mean, here, for example, I hear very different numbers of how many people live in Nairobi slums. And I think the answer is probably that they don't really know. And the slums are expanding, and they're moving, and they're shifting, and the city is expanding beyond control. So data, first thing. Second thing is technical skills. And I think that's quite obvious. And then the third one is probably even more obvious, and that's money. Only 10% of the money that's needed is currently reaching the local level. And that also has to do with the fact that cities often can't borrow money at the national or international markets to realize projects. They are dependent on the national government to do that. And in many places, the mayor and the person in charge at the national level, the ruling party, might not necessarily get along. So that, of course, also has some implications as well.
Yeah,
I can elaborate, but stop
and
here.
data. It's always a question about data. I think that is where we are all the time ending up. The data collection is of so importance, has a very, very high importance. So, and when you see then some countries, as you mentioned, have data collection, but that is happening in a variety of ways. So even if there is data collection, it's very difficult to compare the data between different nations, even between different regions, because there are a variety of doing this collection of data in the existing data collection places. So I think that, in my opinion, it would be great if we could have a global framework for data collection, a global framework where we could have the data collection and that we could connect it to the things that we need to measure and that we need to follow up. And then we could also compare each other with each other. Because I was talking to a lot of mayors, and they are saying that one thing that is also triggering the energy transition and making things go faster is that there is always a little kind of friendly competition, you know? When you see the neighbor municipality starting to do something, you don't want to be lacking behind. You want to run up and be, you know, running beside them and doing things in a common manner. And they have also told to me that if the data is available and I can see what the other guys are doing, it's also easier for me run faster. So I think it has many good benefits with the data collection.
100%
we have a question
agree.
in the chat box.
And maybe just quickly to follow up on that is, I think, I mean, there is really big efforts by lots of city networks to harmonize data collection. And also there is like greenhouse gas emission protocols, but again, then we come like to the technical capacities, because I mean, I look at these questions that need to be filled in, and I've been actually trying to advise them in the past of how to simplify the questionnaires. So I look at these questions, I'm like, I work in renewables and I've been working in this for a while, and I need to read them 4 times. So if I need to read them 4 times, what does that mean if that's somebody in a city that is not only having to do this, but 500 other different things, data collection, not only in energy, but water and nature and whatever, and maybe also having to run the education program in parallel. I mean, this is then really difficult. So also, how can we ensure that the questions that we ask are relevant? Because the questions that we ask also determine the answers that we get. And I've been looking through some of the questioning, and it was like one city saying, I think that they're installing, I think it was 10 million megawatt of solar PV. And I'm like, huh, if you really go ahead with that, I think our climate crisis will be pretty much solved. So of course, I mean, it was just, they didn't know how to answer the question. So probably also a question of unit.
Yeah, it is a problem. The questions need to be generic and in some way enough strong for data collection, but at the same time so simple that people actually can make it to do the reporting. It's very, very, very important also. So maybe there could be like one more complex data collection for science, and then one more easy way of follow up to just show some progress and do some more mandatory follow-up. Yes, so great. We have a question from Aimoha in the chat box, and she's asking if you have studies of the cost of not doing measure to mitigate the climate change. We compare the cost of the mitigation measures with not doing any measures, but not to act has a higher cost, I think.
Amazing question. You are so right. I just posted into the chat a study that I've read. I think it's fairly new from earlier this year on the cost of inaction. And I mean, I don't remember the numbers, but it's very clear that, of course, then the cost of inaction are much higher than the cost of action today. But I think it also, there we come back again a little bit to the political leadership and skills is, when I talk to decision makers, they're telling me, well, great that I can implement this project, but it's going to take 10 or 15 years until I see an effect. But I need to put money on the table today. And in brackets, that's not going to help me to get reelected. So if decision-making cycles are, I mean, they're short, politicians often have an interest in getting reelected. And then we have targets in the future for 2050. And I'm not going to be cynical here, but when these targets are passed and I look around the room, I'm like, a lot of people who've just signed off to this target are most likely not going to be alive when 2050 comes. So what does that mean for our decision-making power and our ability to plan in that horizon? So that's why I always say, think, okay, look, if you want to have a target, phenomenal, but tell me not what you're going to do in 2050, tell me what you're going to do in the next 6 months and then in the next year and where you want to be in 3 years. But that also means, I think often if we think about these processes, that sometimes we also need to think about, are there some quick wins that politicians can also use and build on to also get more public support for the energy transition in their own cities, so that the cost of because that cost of inaction question, it is also so much in the future that they're like, well, by 2050, in brackets, that's not when I'm going to be in office anymore. I need to think about my municipal budgets today. So it's really this massive disconnect. So how can we create quick wins that we can also then create the pathway to have more money and also more interest in having these projects be realized by politicians? And then second, of course, how can we just get more money into cities overall? And third, how can we ensure that all the projects that are being done at the city level have a climate angle to it? And I'm not going to name and shame, but it's a city in Germany, and they've built a new bridge, and there's a bike path. It stops in front of the bridge, and it continues afterwards. There was clearly not a phenomenal coordination. You have these new roads and not a single tree. Or you have trees that are planted in the middle of the bike path. How can you ensure that every single project that gets realized is also a climate project? That's the third thing. So great question about inaction and the link.
Great questions and also great answers. It is for sure really possible to not act. And I wanted to have, I see there is another question here. If we go to another topic and we go back to fossil fuels. So the question is about what is your opinion? Like, how do you believe that we can communicate the topic of subsidized fossil fuels? Do you think that we need to create more awareness about this, or is it a topic that is of not importance?
I think it's a really important topic, but often these subsidies are also how the government or how they're often being sold is the national, we need to ensure that people can pay their energy bills. That's why we need the subsidies. I would argue, and please don't quote me on this, although it's being recorded, we saw that during after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, we saw energy prices go up like crazy, but we also saw profits of energy companies rise and having record profits. So you had even more subsidies, you had very high prices, and you had record profits of the major fossil fuel companies, energy companies. That makes you wonder a little bit of where the money actually went to. So I think the question of subsidies, we need to think more about how to communicate about it. Yes, but I also not think it's not only a question of communication, but then also thinking about how can we ensure that we shift subsidies into more investment in renewables, but while at the same time also ensuring that this is a just shift, that it doesn't hit the people who are already suffering from high energy bills the most. I mean, I think we've really seen during the energy crisis that there were people who couldn't pay their bills anymore. They had to shut off the heat. So how can we ensure that if we shift into renewables, that it's not coming accompanied with high energy prices to heat your home and light the lights in your home, because we also know that low costs of installing new renewable capacity in a country does not necessarily mean that people are going to have lower energy costs. These are unfortunately sometimes a bit disconnected mechanisms as well. And of course, I see the question about the presentation. Yes, of course, I'm also happy to make a PDF available, but I might need to clean up the notes at the bottom a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we appreciate that a lot. So we have one last question regarding the youth topic. So what would you say, in what way can the local policymakers empower youths? How can they support that youth are actually participating in the energy transition? How can you make room, or what kind of activities can you create in this?
I think there's a lot of things that can be done. One, and I think this is for youth, but also more general public, is I mean, I used to live in Paris. I could vote on the municipal budget. And it was then the municipal budget allocation. There was a part of it that could be voted on by people, and that also meant that people cared where it went into. And often this municipal budget allocation vote also influenced the broader decision-making of the city. If there was a lot of people voting for climate, measures green, more trees, more renewables, more bike lanes, it was also very likely that this influenced the wider decision-making of the city. That's of course for youth, but also more general. I think a city also has the opportunity to make available for youth, but also just for community energy projects, rooftop space, if they want to have an energy cooperative. And then I think as a last thing is, I think if we talk about skills and skill shortages, there is an opportunity at the local level, but of course also at the national level, to have youth be in closer contact with what it means and what the climate crisis means. That means being able to visit projects, being able to really get in touch with nature and the energy topic. When you're in a university, are there opportunities beyond the curriculum to really dive into these topics? Can it be made mandatory to learn about the energy crisis, about the climate crisis? I think if I talk to a lot of urban planners, they are all phenomenal urban planners, but many of them don't learn of how to do climate resilient urban planning. So there is a need to also think about, if we train people, how can we ensure that in this training, there's also the skills are being learned for the future to also facilitate the energy transition. Goes back to heat pumps. If you want to install a heat pump, well, great if there's incentives, financial and fiscal incentives. If you don't find anybody who's going to do it for you, you are pretty much forced to revert back to a traditional source. So I think cities and local governments, but also national governments, can do a lot there to incentivize and support such skill creation when it comes to in just the normal school, apprenticeship, university curriculum, but also for the reskilling then afterwards.
Yes, indeed. There is a lot of things to do, and it's a great engagement. And I think that we are approaching our end of this session. We have a few minutes left. Let's just see if there is any more questions in the chat box. Let's see here if somebody else has written anything. Otherwise, I think this is our last question. Do you have anything else that you would like to add, Lea, before we are wrapping up?
Yeah, I think just as a last thing, there's now so many cool projects for youth to become part of a regional networks, of national networks, of international networks, to join trainings. I mean, I think like this climate leader circle, like the hangouts, like really these kind of things. So I really encourage everybody who's interested in this topic to just join these things. I mean, I can also share a couple of resources. Many conferences are now providing youth the opportunity to submit abstracts, to apply to become a youth ambassador. And these are all really cool opportunities to get involved in, because I always say, well, it's great to learn in a university curriculum, but it's even better if you just get the chance to meet and chat and exchange and listen and just be part of the conversation. And I've personally been seeing a big shift to when I first started, and I mean, I'm not old either, but when I first started in the energy space, I was not only one of the very few women, but also as a young woman, like people would literally almost refuse to speak with me. And within a couple of years, that has changed completely. youth is being invited to be part of the conversation. They're being heard, and to really make the most of it, not let go of the pressure and the opportunity that's now there. I mean, the Secretary General of the UN now has a youth advisory group. Like almost everybody is now really, creating that space. And there's so many cool opportunities. So I just encourage everybody to grab them and be part of that conversation, because it's really encouraging and it's also fun.
Yeah, wonderful. That is really great. So I think for the last words, engaging the youth, creating groups of youth who are engaged is something that we all can bring with us and see how we can implement it and continue to build on that. I think also that another work package for another project can be how we can motivate the decision makers and make them really understand why it is costing more to not act. So I think this is things we can bring with us from this wonderful webinar. It was really great to hang out with all of you. And again, a very, very warm thank you to you, Lea, for joining us and being here with us today and giving us this wonderful presentation. I think that we all really enjoyed listening to you. So very, very many thanks to you for being here with us today.
No, thank you to you. Thank you to you, Isabella, and for you, Lina, for organizing everything. This was phenomenal and super fun. And I also dropped my email in the chat in case anybody wants to reach out and connect. I'm always happy to.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Really great. So I also want to invite everybody before we end this, that we have the next climate leader session on the 13th of June, 13 June. And then we have Seamus Horner from TUS University, who will be joining us for the climate leaders lunch hangout. So I will just drop the link here if Lina haven't done it yet, so that if anybody wants to register, you can do that at once if you like to on mark your calendars. So many, many thanks to everybody. Please enjoy your afternoon and hope to see you all soon again. Take care and have a good
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Lina.